There we go. Cool. Um, awesome. Well, Bill, thank you again so much for making the time. And this is just, considering that you were not only a cornerstone of what got me into all of this in the first place, but really a champion at such an early stage of the book itself. It really does mean a lot
Well,
to speak with you at this point in the journey.
the pleasure's mine, and I'm really glad the book is out. Since I'm a interviewer from way back, let me start by asking you a couple of questions, okay? And just I think it's often useful for people to hear just kind of what it was that got you going, that inspired you to write the book, and at the end of the process, what it is you're hoping it conveys to people out there in the world.
Yeah. Well, thinking back, it's been now about 4 years since the project got started. So it's fun to look back on that point when we felt like it was something we wanted to embark on. I think that it really came out of this feeling that we've had graduating amid not only, an ongoing climate crisis, but the pandemic. We graduated in the class of 2020. We both, my co-author Tom and I, felt this sense of like, what did we just experience? Like we both had been studying really different things in college. I had studied environmental studies and therefore had taken classes in a wide variety of disciplines. And he had studied psychology. And so he had been thinking about a pretty different set of questions. And we had both had different experiences with climate work, whether it was entrepreneurship on his part or activism on my part. And I think we just hadn't fully metabolized like all of the different ideas that we had been exposed to and just the experience of being a young person moving through a liberal arts college environment and getting told a lot of different stories about, what is going on with the climate crisis. You go into an economics classroom and you hear one thing, and you go into an anthropology classroom and you hear another thing, and then psychology and the list goes on. And then you go into the dining hall and all of a sudden you talk to people who have been hearing some pretty different things from you. And it can be a really challenging experience to sort of synthesize all the different ways of talking about climate and talking about not just whether it's happening, but really the level of urgency that it asks of us and the types of action that it asks of us. And so we wrote the book really hoping to sort of depict the experience of doing that synthesis and doing it with somebody as part of a relationship and a conversation. And also hopefully, let other young people and people of all ages know that they're certainly not the only ones trying to do that synthesis and trying to figure out where to go from there.
One of the things that's always, I think, interesting for authors is you've written this book, and then it's, as you've now found out, a year or 18 months or something between the time you write the book and the time it really emerges into the world. It's usually a longer gestation than having a baby. Um, and in the meantime, you're doing all these other things, and you're young, so a high percentage of your adult life has been lived in the time since you finished writing this book. You've been to Kenya, you've been over to DOE, on and on and on. Does it feel like your perspective is shifting, enlarging, doubling down as time goes on?
Yeah. No, it's a good point. As a percentage, it has been it's been a lot has happened the past 4 years and 100% of my adulthood has happened. Um, but yeah, I think the 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 biggest thing that I think crystallized for me in that time came from my experience at the DOE. And I think it was reminding me immediately when I went there, it was brought back to the time when I first met Tom, and I was just sort of floored by he just had this sense of like, wow, it is really hard to build a new energy company. Certainly one that can operate at scale. There are just so many things that can go wrong, and so many people that need to be coordinated, and huge financial risk, and just a lot that I had no expertise and no personal experience really reckoning with. And I think that perspective was what in part led him to feel sort of skeptical of these folks like me who were saying, hey, we should just like, phase out this entire set of energy tools that we've built and spent decades building. Because he was like, it's not that easy. Like you got to build something new, and it's really hard to do that. So the folks at DOE were just absolutely like astonishing in terms of the scale and pace at which they were engaged in that work of building the new systems. And they were hard at work deploying the funding allocated in the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, which, of course, when we were in college, it was unimaginable that such laws would be passed in the subsequent years. But so it was amazing to just sort of be part of that moment in history. But just the work and it ranged from like scientific expertise to economic expertise that was being all brought together. And then the hard work of also working with communities who are considering hosting this new infrastructure and helping them think about, well, do we even want this? Like, what is this going to mean for us? Why is this going to be different from the past infrastructure? It was really humbling to sort of be part of that work and to sort of see the other side of that Tom had sort of seen himself firsthand of what it looks like to sort of start from the ground up on what the future could look like.
It's such a, I mean, what's happening at the DOE right now really is kind of without precedent. I think at least back to perhaps the Apollo moonshots of the 60s, just a concentrated federal effort around a particular technology and the having to coordinate vast numbers of operations and installations all across the country. It's amazing to watch, and people like Jigar Shah are really performing pretty heroically, it seems to me, as they're trying to do it. So you have a firsthand look, and I hope you've been taking notes, um, because it's a story that needs to be told again and again, I think, going forward.
Yeah. Well, one question that I had for you, sort of related to Jigger and to the work at DOE was actually, you know, sparked when I was there and I was at this conference that Jigger organized, and you appeared as a speaker, and I wasn't expecting that, and I sort of was very excited to see your name on the list alongside, a lot of other business leaders and technologists who sort of are you're more accustomed to seeing in those conversations. And it was, having thought about the at times wide gulf between the conversations happening within activist circles and conversations happening within those circles, it was really inspiring for me to see you and Jigger connect and sort of try to bridge that divide in that context. And I was just wondering, as you think about, you've obviously been doing this work for a really long time and spoken with a lot of different people who do and do not agree with, your view of the world. And I'm curious how you think about, choosing which types of conversations and interlocutors are really important to reach out to and connect to and converse with in moving this work forward, even if maybe there's some differences in the way you think about things
Sure.
versus when you think about, what, this is someone who maybe isn't even worth giving airtime to, or this is a conversation that isn't moving anything
Sure.
forward.
Most important interlocutors for me are frontline people having to live with the results of climate change and of fossil fuel despoliation, and scientists. It's because of scientists that we understand the fix that we're in, and they're the ones who've given us the time limit that we have to deal with it. They speak up for chemistry and physics, who are in the end the ultimate arbiters here. Um, I don't have any. After 30 years, I've concluded there's not the slightest point in trying to deal with the representatives of the fossil fuel industry. They've spent the last 3.5 decades lying and doing everything they can to stifle progress. Um, I talk with politicians, but I think usually the effective talk with politicians comes from organizing and from, either presenting them with people who can make their lives easier or make their lives harder. I mean, that's, what organizing is about. And I'm increasingly interested in speaking with those engineers and entrepreneurs who are doing the work of building out the alternative to fossil fuel. Look, the climate problem in its most basic elements is not that complicated. It's caused mostly by burning fossil fuel. And the only way to get to deal with it is to stop burning fossil fuel. And the only way to do that is to have something that will replace fossil fuel. The scientists have done their job. They've lowered the price of sun, wind, and batteries so substantially that we can now make this switch without financial or technological impossibility anymore. And so it's up to movements to propel that, to make it happen quickly. And there are tensions always between even clean tech entrepreneurs and activists. And you can see them, you can sort of sense where they come from. So, for instance, back in the day, while the Paris Climate Accords were being negotiated in Paris, a bill came up in Congress to end the ban on oil exports from the US. And in the end, and in return, there were going to be tax credits for the wind industry. Some of us in the environmental community said this is a bad trade, we shouldn't do it. But the clean tech guys wanted the tax credits, and so they worked on Congress to get it through. And in 10 years, the US has gone from not exporting oil to being the biggest oil exporter in the world. This was, the clean tech guys were not the main guys pushing for it, but they prized their, economic fortune over the actual needs of the planet. So I'm happy to work with them as long as the work is in service of the climate. But I don't lose track of the fact that that it's been activists and movement people without any hope or request for financial recompense that have done the work over decades to make it possible for us to be in this situation now. The reason that we have an IRA is because people, especially young people, built this movement around the Green New Deal. And when it got to Congress, it was eventually watered down into the IRA. It's a good thing they started at $30 trillion because we got $1 trillion out of it. It's a good reminder of, how this stuff works. I don't think that the clean tech industry quite understands the debt that they owe the young people who did that work. And I think often they tend to scorn them a little bit, or think of them as kind of scruffy and, whatever. So my goal always is to keep the temperature from going any higher than it has to. And one of the ways that we're going to do this is by deploying lots of renewable energy. So I'm happy to work with people who are doing that. But I hope that they remember in turn that that's the job. The job is not to make their shareholders rich. In the end, the job is to protect a planet that actually works.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have any advice either for, for young Tom and Eve in the book or other young people today who are kind of, on, I don't know if as you were reading the book, you had things that you wish you could have advised us or things you wish you could have advised young people who are sort of just like right and left, like bumping up against these other people in their lives who, just don't quite see the path forward the same way that they do. And they're trying to decide whether to engage, critically with those debates or just sort of do it their way. You know, that was something that I think we both reckon with a lot of like, at what point do you just sort of say, let's agree to disagree and do our things over here and over here versus kind of continuing those dialogues.
I'm a big believer in the idea that movements need to be broad and include as many people and ideas as possible to the point, right to the point where they start to work at cross purposes. You know, and and I think that young people are coming into this right now at a fantastically interesting point. You know, for many years, um, we knew that we had to get off fossil fuel, but lacking an affordable alternative, it was difficult to do more than make the sort of rudimentary steps. Now, as of 4 or 5 years ago, the price of clean energy has crossed some invisible line where it's cheaper than coal and gas and oil. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's a brand new world, 3 or 4 years old. And it's very hard for that to sink in, even for um, well-intentioned people from an earlier generation, because we grew up in a different world, I think. So people still talk about sun and wind as alternative energy, as if it was kind of the Whole Foods of energy, you know. It's the Costco of energy. It's the cheap stuff that's available in bulk all of a sudden. And and I think it's going to be the next generation, that's your generation, that's sort of in the same way that people from 10 or 15 years ago started calling themselves digital natives, and were at home in the world of the internet in a way that I'll never quite be. You're native in a world uh, where where the possibilities are right in front of us. In some ways, that's a huge improvement, and in some ways, that makes the whole thing all the more fraught. It's one thing to fail in this task for the lack of an alternative. It's another to let the planet overheat because we couldn't get our act together politically to do it fast enough. 40 years from now, by the time you're my age, we're going to run the planet on sun and wind. It's all but free. Um, but if it takes us anything like 40 years to get there, the planet that you're running on sun and wind is going to be a broken planet, a planet without ice at the poles, without the odd coral reef in between, you know, racked by storm and flood and fire. So now the task is, I mean, we can almost, I mean, we can, the scientists have done their work. The engineers have done much of their work, you know. There's plenty, there's always more engineering and iteration and things to do, but the tools they've given us, cheap solar panels, cheap wind turbines, and ever cheaper batteries, are sufficient to the transition that we have at hand. So now the work is for policy people and economists, and I think above all for activists to be pushing that process and making it happen. And if it does, then we're in a really stunning place. I mean, you know, by the time, as again, by the time you're my age, there's no reason that we should be setting things on fire on this planet. Human beings and combustion have been synonymous for a few 100,000 years, but we don't need it anymore. You know, we can douse the fire under the hood of your car, and the one in the furnace in your basement, and the one in the power plant, and even the one on the stove in your kitchen, and rely instead on the fact that the good Lord hung a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky. And we have the wit to make full use of it. That transition would be the most beautiful and interesting thing that's happened in our species in a very, very long time. And and if it happens fast, then we'll have some of the beautiful world that we were born into. And if it doesn't happen fast, then it'll be a sick joke on us all.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's interesting because I think so, one of the themes of the book is the fact that, in many ways it is really heartening that in many circles we've moved past this point of like, okay, is the climate changing and do we need to do something about it? And now it's this debate of, okay, well, what is it exactly that we do? And but then within that space, there's a lot of these riffs that are just really serious riffs about, what the answer to that question is. And I think, at the Department of Energy, something that we, that came up a lot was that, a lot of the challenges were segmented into these, different sectors and different decarbonization pathways. And, I think to your point, sun, wind, there were certain pathways that were no-brainers. That it's sort of like, okay, we've just got to scale, we've just got to deploy capital to sort of scale these solutions that we know well. Um, and then there are these other sectors where it's just a little thornier and it's a little bit more complicated, things like
Yeah,
cement or things like building materials. And
sure.
so no, it's just a question to say like, how do you kind of think about this moment that we're in where there's like this question about delay and about pacing of like of change, and some of that is about intentional delay on the part of the fossil fuel industry, and some of it is about kind of getting us over that last threshold to places where we can like safely deploy new technologies.
Sure.
And so anyway, how do
I
you kind of
mean,
think about delay in the context of that today?
eyes on the prize. The stuff we can do right now, which is sun, wind, and batteries, we can do at such a large scale that we can deal with 70% of the trouble that we're facing. California this year, I was just writing about this for the New Yorker. California this year finally crossed some point where there's enough solar and enough batteries deployed that for the last 100 days, for large parts of each day, they've produced more than 100% of their power from renewable energy, which means that when the sun goes down at night, the biggest source of power is often the batteries on the grid. There were no batteries on that grid 3 years ago. I mean, the speed with which this has happened is astonishing, and that can be replicated everywhere. And that should be the main work of the next 4 or 5 years, an all-out sprint around the world to deploy clean energy technology. And while we're doing that, I have no doubt that people will continue coming up with lots of new, ideas about how to make cement and the other hard to abate technologies. We're already getting there on most of them. And truthfully, I think that most of those answers are going to turn out to be the same answer, which is we electrify this and we run it off sun and wind. Because the very rapid fall in the price of that ongoing every quarter means that all the kind of competing ideas are just face an endless wall to climb financially. I don't think we're going to do hydrogen on a huge scale because I think it's cheaper and smarter to just electrify things and run them straight off the current. And look, the Chinese are apparently getting medium haul planes anyway that they can run on batteries, which seems like the absolute last and hardest thing to figure out how to do. Um, uh, but we can take care of. I mean, we have most of the. My way of looking at those technological questions is most of the efforts to do things, I think, like hydrogen and carbon sequestration and stuff, are efforts by the fossil fuel industry to keep their business model alive. And their business model is we sell you things that we set on fire. And to me, that's generally the tell about whether or not something's a sensible idea or not. But as I say, we've got we've got extraordinary work to do to build out and deploy this stuff that we have sitting in front of us. And it's entirely possible to do. And the fact that it's not we're not viewing it politically as the single most critical and obvious thing to be doing on our planet drives me a little crazy. Because people for 100,000 years are going to pay the price for what we do or don't do in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Um, another question which I've been being asked and then and answering, and I want to ask you um is how you kind of think about the liberal arts college as a unique entity in this moment.
Very, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Not just in the context of divestment, but just more
No,
broad.
no, it's such a good question. I think that climate change is a fascinating, I think it offers the possibility actually of being the topic that kind of rescues the liberal arts university in a lot of ways. Um, the thing that happened at universities, and I've spent my life sort of on the periphery of them anyway, is that everybody emulated the hard sciences, um, where you prospered by breaking problems down into ever smaller increments, and studying them in ever more detail. It worked so well in physics and chemistry and biology that people started to think that that's how we should approach sociology and psychology and literature and every other thing. And it hasn't worked as well in those places. And and truthfully, uh, we're reaching the point where the advances, even in physics and chemistry and engineering, now require the cooperation of these other disciplines in order to be deployed in the ways that they must. So, what I'm trying to say is, um, climate change is so big that it's less a topic than it is a lens through which to view the world. And that requires good thinking from physicists and chemists, but also from economists and political scientists, but also from theologians and sociologists and psychologists. It requires everybody to figure out how to come together to address or to look at the world through this lens. The lens for the last 100 years, if we're honest about it, in our world and in our universities, the lens through which we looked at things was economic growth. Um, in essence, the question we asked about things is, will this make our economy larger? And if we did it, if the answer was yes, then we did it. And you can tell that that's how universities, rolled, because all of a sudden, there were a lot more marketing majors than there were literature majors on campus. Um, Now, the lens through which we look at the world, I think, most productively, is this lens of survival, or perhaps of trying to imagine thriving on a world that's not easy. And that's going to require, yes, some science and engineering and some economics, but it also requires, probably even more than that, some strong thinking about how to get along with each other, how to do things as a community, as a nation, as a world. And those are really the topics that philosophy and sociology and psychology and theology and should help us approach. So I've been impressed by the way. Often I'll go to give a talk at a university, and the people who have me there will invite people from across the university there for dinner or something, and I'll be astounded because all these people will be working on climate change from their different directions, but often they've never met each other, and they're certainly not working together, and they need to be. This is a way to break down some of those silos. So let me ask you almost the same question as we end here. Um, you're a poet too. Um, how does this work bleed over into that work? How do you uh, how do you approach the world in its in the deepest ways?
Um, I really appreciate you asking that. Well, it's funny. I was actually just thinking about this the other day. I was remembering the fact that my favorite poet, Mary Oliver, actually passed away during the time that we narrate in this book. So kind of right when I was really getting involved with the divestment campaign, and it kind of sparked not only because of that, but also because of a friend, Nuri, who I met in the campaign, who's also a poet. Just it me getting involved in this campaign kind of coincided with a resurgence of poetry in my life. And I think just from then until till still today, I think that because so many of the questions that are posed by the climate crisis are so um, at best ineffable, but at worst like terrifying and overwhelming. Poetry is this medium that is just so comforting to me and freeing to me as a way of just processing all of that. And it's a place that you can just sort of break the rules of communication that you are sort of forced to comply with in conversations and in the world. Um, and I find that it's kind of the space where I feel the most just able to let myself feel all the things that I feel, not only when thinking about this problem, but also just moving through the world, which is still a very beautiful one. Um, and so it is, you know, I think the best way that I've found, alongside you know, all of the other important survival and thriving skills, you know, just to sort of make sense of this moment that we're in.
Well, I think you're so right. I've been very lucky in my life to get to know, among other things, some of the great poets of our time, Mary Oliver, but Wendell Berry and Gary Snyder and Terry Tempest Williams and so many more. Um, and I think one thing, the community of nature writers, people who write about this world, is a wonderful collection of people, far less ego-ridden than most writing communities that I know. And I think the reason is that um, just what you just said a minute ago about the fact that it's still a beautiful world. If it's part of your practice to spend some large part of each day that you can outdoors, it's hard to get too fixated on yourself. Um, it's a good reminder that you're a small part of something very big and very beautiful. And that's comforting when things are going badly. The idea that it's a big universe and uh, uh, but it's also um, for me at least deeply motivating. The idea that there are others out here in this encounter with this world doing what they can. And I've always been amazed by the fact that almost all those people that I just named, and many, many, many more um, great writers, also have become great, devoted, involved activists in this work. The line between them, those two ways of being with the world, is thin and stretches easily. So, um, welcome to all of this on many counts. Congratulations on the book. It's always fun to greet people at the start of a great career, and just to say many, many thanks for doing this work. Many, many thanks for all the work you'll do down the road, and I'll look forward to getting to do some of it shoulder to shoulder with you.
Thank you, Bill, so much. That really means a lot to me, and thank you really for just an extraordinary lifetime of work on this topic and and support.
See you down the road. Take care, friend.
Bye.
Bye.